Hi. Thanks, Jesse, for that introduction. So I'm a little flushed from all of the flattery, I guess. But I'm Jessica. I'm very excited to be speaking here. It's a real honor to share a stage with all of these other voices, including some of my most favorite and famous colleagues. So I design content for interactions and products. And allow me to unflush myself for a minute. So right now I lead content and design at stellar.org. And I'm an advisor at an early stage startup called Copper, which you'll hear more about later. I also wrangled words for a bunch of other companies, Evernote, Medium, Delicious Monster, all the greats. So, sorry, I'm nervous. OK, so as someone who works on products, the thing that I've learned is that sometimes you tell the story, and, well, sometimes the story tells you. So you really, really, really want to be in that first camp, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, I'm going to start by telling all of you a story. So once upon a time, not that long ago, there was a man who felt, we will say, overwhelmed by modern life. He was troubled by the aesthetic abomination of things designed for an increasingly vocal and powerful consumer base. And he felt that by engaging with industry, which sort of single-mindedly drove consumption of these products, he was losing himself. So he made a decision. He's like, I'm going to relinquish most of the luxuries and many of the so-called comforts of life, and I'm going to retreat to the woods to see if I can live happily and productively. And the person that I'm talking about, of course, is Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau is a transcendentalist, and on July 4th, 1845, he sort of quietly declared his independence from civilized life, and he went to the woods to learn to live deliberately. So those of us here in this room, I think, have a lot to learn from him, and not just about the stunning facial hair. Right? Thoreau was making things in an environment that was actually very similar to ours. The mid-19th century was a heady moment for consumer culture. The expansion of the railroad meant that goods traveled further, faster than at any point in history. And the explosion of newspapers meant that news also traveled further, faster than at any point in history. And so products and information were coming at people at a speed that was thrilling and really exciting, but also anxiety-inducing and kind of difficult to comprehend. Does that sound familiar at all? So in the midst of all of this innovation and uncertainty, Thoreau was a maker, right? His tools were salvaged boards and other building materials and words. So he wrote Walden to give an account of what he built and why it mattered. And in Walden, this book that I think a lot of us are required to read in high school, and we're like, oh, that's cool, he goes to the woods, that's nice. But Walden gets sort of at the heart of design. How, Thoreau asks, do we take something messy and inefficient and make it useful and usable? And how do we build things that give people back time and energy? So how many people here have a mortgage or pay what you would consider to be an exorbitant amount of rent? Yeah. Me too. And if you live in the Bay Area, I think that last one definitely applies to you. And if you didn't raise your hand and you live in the Bay Area, I want to know who your landlord is so that I can steal your apartment from you. And it wasn't really all that different back then. So Thoreau picks houses as his design challenge for one very simple reason. They cost too damn much. So rather than buying a house, he decides to build his own. Right? And the tiny house he builds at Walden Pond costs $28.12. But money is not the only thing he's solving for. So like us, Thoreau's peers spent more than just cash on their houses, right? The structures were time-consuming and exploitative. They required dedicated female labor and contingent hired labor or slavery to maintain, right? This was not a good situation. So in designing a more efficient alternative, Thoreau sort of forces us to ask, how much time do we spend of our own lives and others' lives dealing with the things we own? Do these things consume more life than they should? And I'm kind of like joking around with all of these references to The Office, but that show, I think, touches in some rather profound ways on some of the things that Thoreau is warning us about. So in thinking about this problem of life consumed by the things we own, Thoreau defines his metrics in terms that are like only indirectly related to money. The cost of a thing is the amount of what I will call life, which is required to be exchanged for it immediately or in the long run. So houses that cost less life improve our existence by cutting down on maintenance and opening up time for other things. But for Thoreau, a better house means a house that's like primarily functional, right? It's a dwelling that's suited to its purpose. It supplies exactly what is necessary with nothing extra. It gives its inhabitants the space and the time to live. So cost is a more layered concept than cash outlay, right? What do the things we design cost people in time, in energy, in focus? How much life do our products, even when they're ostensibly free, require? So this, of course, this entire line of thinking is the beginning of our minimalism. And in the 1840s, we get sort of the germ of the idea that becomes this famous maxim, form follows function, which I'm sure all of you have heard of. And I think those of us who make digital things like to think of this as building things that are beautiful because they solve problems. So it was the architect Louis Sullivan who wrote Form Ever Follows Function in 1896. But it was a different man who actually is credited with the idea. So in 1843, 2 years before Thoreau went to the woods to begin his experiment, Horatio Greenough wrote of building and form, "Let us begin from the heart as the nucleus and work outward." So Thoreau took this very seriously, right? He built out from his core need for shelter and ended up with a tight, shingled and plastered house. It was 10 feet wide, 15 feet long. It had a garret, a closet, 2 large windows, 2 trapdoors, 1 door at the end, and a brick fireplace. And you can think of it as the beginning of the tiny house movement. Portland doesn't even know. But there is also the book, right? Walden is a design manual that offers its own proof of concept, right? It only exists because the house that Thoreau builds gives him the freedom or the life to write the pages. So in the story that he tells about building his house, he gets at kind of a profound truth. And I think it applies even to those of us who work at computers building digital products. We do our best work when we build things that cost less life, right? When we give people space and time to live. So a big piece of this is storytelling. It's our responsibility when we make things to set up a visual and linguistic framework to guide our users, right? So as a writer, as someone who designs with words, I'm going to drill down into that linguistic side now. When you tell the story, your app actually functions like a choose-your-own-adventure tale, right? It functions like it should. Through a series of choices, the user develops a story that reflects their particular way of moving through the product. But when the story tells you, you leave people to sort of cobble together a coherent narrative, right? And they might be cobbling it together out of like repurposed marketing copy or like unhelpful error messages or loosely translated technical jargon, right? But if it's not by, and I feel like you're probably about to ask me, like if it's not by copying and pasting stuff that like the marketing team or the brand agency gave me, how do I actually do this? How do I tell my product story? And the motto I have for this process is actually Thoreau's. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. And this motto is ambitious because it's deceptively difficult. I think we all here know that simplicity and elegance are the result, the privilege of clarity, and clarity takes time. Like any creative process, telling a simple, true story is 90% drafting and revising and throwing things out. So I'm going to break it down, this process of like telling a simple, true story, into 5 steps. And I'm going to use our recent work at Copper, which just launched last week. And if you saw Jared on the panel yesterday evening, he's one of the great minds behind Copper. But I'm going to use our recent work at Copper as a case study. Okay, to start with, define your terms. And you do this in the way that like persnickety word people do this, which means not using phrases like fast, easy, better, frictionless, reinvented, a new way to blank as sort of empty crutches to convey meaning. If you go to Product Hunt on any given day, you'll see at least 3 new products that are billing themselves as some assortment of like fast, easy, better. It's so common that I'm not even trying to pick on these. They just like could have been chosen at random. But I do think that my favorite one is the one in the middle, which is like a better way to get things done. I'm like, what is that? What does it do? So if your product really actually is setting out to be faster, easier, or better than a solution that already exists for the same problem, it's imperative to say how. If your terms are vague, it's highly likely that your product strategy is nebulous too. So Copper's primary product at the moment is a developer's tool, right? A sign-up flow for your app or website. And that sign-up flow is, of course, faster, easier, and better than other sign-up flow solutions. But if you look at the website, what you see is, in fact, 1 fast, 2 easy, 3 better, disguised with actual details. So I like to call on, you can call on the ghost of your former English teacher. As a former English teacher, I call on the ghost of myself by reminding myself to not offer vague platitudes. I think one of the ways that we have respect for our users is by taking the time to be clear and specific about what we do. So defining your terms, being specific about what you do, is a step towards formulating what I call a product thesis. And this involves answering some questions. What are we building? Why are we building it? What is the purpose of this product or feature? What is its core functionality? And I'm a writer, which means that I believe, possibly to a fault, in the power of a good thesis. But how many times did you write a terrible paper in school because you didn't know what exactly you were actually trying to say? It works the same way in design. Formulating a thesis helps your team focus and make strategic decisions. So you can say form follows function. We can sort of adhere to this like minimalist ideal, but it's rather empty of meaning until you can articulate what precisely you're building. So Copper, for example, is building a password-free sign-up flow for products. And our thesis involves the theory of change, right? That was then, and this is Copper. The idea of the product is that it saves developers the time they would normally spend building sign-up, verifying info, supporting passwords, and on the other side, it gives users smooth authentication. So we hypothesize that the web will be a more inclusive place to build and use products if we move past passwords instead of trying to manage them. And that argument informs all of our design decisions. So defining terms and formulating a thesis, this is how we create a linguistic framework. Successful products have a point of view. And establishing a voice early on, I think, helps create a unified narrative. It's not just clear messaging around the product. It's also clear language that moves the user through the experience. So your product voice is what I'm saying is your product voice should be deployed everywhere. What we somewhat dismissively call microcopy actually matters. from the lowliest error message to quick success states to navigation items, your product should always sound like itself. And contrary to much of what shows up in the app world, style and point of view don't have to mean extraneous sass or pep. Right? We have enough sassy apps in the world, I think. So Copper is a utility, right? We're not entertainment, we're not a social network. As a product, our values are that we aim to be straightforward, we aim to be trustworthy, we aim to be lightweight. We focus on benefiting real people who build and use for the web rather than on enterprise data collection. And those values are serious, right? They're not cute. And every word and visual cue in the product reflects them. But we know that those values can also be a little heavy. So we strive to maintain an accessible conversational tone. And I hate to be the one to break this to you, but an easygoing tone is not easy to achieve. It's not just sort of transcribing your own thoughts. Since the time of these screenshots, we've actually changed some of this language because it's not quite there yet. But I can tell you that getting the right words for a button or help text comes a lot more easily after the front-loaded work that I just talked about. And you will get all of this horribly, horribly wrong at first. Really, really wrong. But not because you or your team are bad at it. It's because words are hard, even when you're a professional wordsmith. So when I started working with the Copper team, we were laboring under the delusion that we'd basically have the full story nailed down in a sprint or two. That was 11 months ago. We're still working on it. And for our first impression to the world, here's where we started way back then. And my reaction when I see this now is I want to die a little bit. It's shock and dismay, right? It's kind of like looking at the Delicious Library website, which I did 4 or 5 years ago. We're always iterating, we're always changing. Thank God, that usually means making things better. But when I see this, I'm what is it? What does it do? What is even happening? Someone help. So here, months later, is what we launched with last Thursday. And I'm not going to lie, I thought this was pretty good. Not bad. Clear, it makes sense, we get what it's for, I think. So I thought it was okay until I saw this. And I was oh, God. The real no-brainer here is password-free instead of passwordless. Right? I wouldn't want a bottom-free mimosa, but I would very much like a world free of passwords. And this public note on Twitter, this this amazing guy just being oh, I have a way better version of your website copy, here you go. This public note on Twitter leads me to the final point in telling your product story, right by listening. And another way of saying this is be humble, which almost goes without saying because the world will sort of force you to be humble. Your users have an experience with your product that you as a maker cannot mimic. But the beauty is that we work by iterating, right? We have this great privilege of putting products out into the world and improving on them publicly. So we took that tweet as a note and changed the language in the midst of launch morning. And this edit, like most good ideas, is pretty obvious in retrospect, but I think sometimes it takes an outside perspective to help you get it just right. And that sort of leads me all the way back around. I think of Thoreau as that sort of crucial outside perspective for the tech community. Was this what Thoreau had in mind? Probably not. Right? He probably wasn't hoping that we'd all go build beautiful websites and digital products. But he borrowed the land at Walden Pond from a friend to build his house, and he had visitors there, and he made visits in town, and kind of infamously, his mother did his laundry. But like us, he was experimenting in public. And Walden was published in 1854, but it's a kind of a poignant reflection on some of our current design conundrums. And the tech world, frankly, could use some new perspectives. We always say we want to design for humans, but if that's true, then the point of product design is not to count clicks or measure what we get from the people who use our products. The point is to make things that fit into the lives of our users, right? That give them space and time for life. And to do that, I think we can take like a pretty hefty page from Thoreau. We can do the hard work, right, of reaching clarity and boiling down to simplicity in order to tell intuitive, thoughtful, deliberate stories. We can design for life. Thanks.